You are seen. You are worthy. You are not alone. The world loses one person to suicide every 40 seconds. Let's change the stats. Together, we can say not suicide. Not today.
Churches and schools. These are institutions that we trust our children to. When we send them there, we expect them to come back the same way, if not better. But what happens when these same institutions are the very ones that's allowing our children to be sexually abused? One young lady has such a story, and even when she went to the principal to report it, the principal also covered it up. Now, as an adult, she sells out TedX talks every time she has one, and she is using her voice for the voiceless and to aid in the healing of the survivors. Join me as I talk to my extraordinary person, Joelle Castex, on this episode of True Crime, Authors, and Extraordinary People.
Welcome to True Crime, Authors, and Extraordinary People, the podcast where we bring two passions together. The show that gives new meaning to the old adage, truth is stranger than fiction, and reminding you that there is an extraordinary person in all of us. Here is your host, David McClam.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to an episode of True Crime, Authors, and Extraordinary People. Of course, I'm your man, David McClam. Hey, if you guys haven't already, make sure you follow us on all of our social media. One link to a link tree gets you every link you need to have pertaining to the show. All right, well, it is once again time for one of those extraordinary people. Let me tell you who our guest is. She blew away audiences at her TedX talk, amassing more than 100,000 views. Organizers saw that activists had known for years she is lightning in a bottle. An accomplished author and journalist, a seasoned speaker, and an in-demand global media interview darling, Joelle's personal journey is just as intriguing and inspirational as her sold-out talks. She endured the typical aftermath of child sexual assault, continued depression, self-destructive behaviors, suicide attempts, and a failed marriage. Somehow she persevered, but by the age of 27, she realized that something had to change. Her pain and decisions had created a life that was a continued emotional failure. There was no way to live. She woke up one morning and with a revelation, she knew she had a choice. If she stayed on her current path, she would die. It was decision time, and she decided it was time to live and time to heal, and everything changed. She is the author of The Well-Armored Child, The Power of Responsibility, Survivor, one of the leading advocates for adult victims of child sexual abuse, and my extraordinary person, Joelle Castex. Joelle, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. It is my honor and pleasure to have you. From what we just read, is there anything that we should know about Joelle that we don't?
Well, I'm a mom of a teenager who's starting his senior year of high school and going through big changes, all those life decisions that happened that year. And I'm happily married to a really cool guy who tolerates me. So we're going on about 19 years now.
I definitely know how that is. I do have one left, 13. My middle child goes to college. The only two of the 6 that is left. I myself have been married now for 20 years and a half with the same person, 22 years. So I feel you on that. So your story is an intriguing one. You've done what we all wanted to do a TEDx talk. I've listened to that extraordinary talk that you said have now changed the world and put you on the path that you're on. I do know that at age 15, you were a sexual abuse victim from your Catholic high school. Can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Yeah, my story is very typical of a lot of survivors of child sexual abuse. I grew up in a home that looked great on the outside, but on the inside was full of a lot of emotional abuse from my mother and her raging alcoholism. And my dad was in this permanent state of denial because all he wanted was a happy family. And I think in his head, he's like, if I just believe it'll happen, it'll happen. And so I was extraordinarily depressed as a kid. And by the time I was, my first couple of years of high school, I was suicidal, ended up in a psychiatric facility for a suicide attempt. And, the school knew that. And at the time, so it's modern day high school in Orange County, California, very well known for its football program and now its big hazing scandal. And this time in the, mid 80s, they knew what was happening to me and promised all their, love and support. Well, I was also a singer and I was being trained to go into opera because, I showed some promise, which never really blossomed because I'm not that good. But back to the story. And so my junior year, a new choir teacher started. And what I didn't know was that the previous choir director had told this guy, hey, Joelle's really vulnerable. Just be careful. She's talented, but, there's problems at home. Well, what ended up happening was he seized on that and began immediately grooming me for sexual abuse. And predatory grooming is the process that a predator uses to trick a kid into thinking that abuse is okay. It's blurring boundaries, it's giving gifts, it's flattery, it's all those things that make a child feel really special and allow the adult to then go into sexual abuse, and the kid just has no idea. So it creates a compliant victim because while a child can never consent to sexual assault, they can either freeze or just not do anything. They're compliant because they've been tricked into thinking that it's okay. And this is how proper relationships are supposed to be. The abuse went on for 2 years. And the most traumatic part of it was that early on, I came forward to school officials and I said, something weird's going on. I was scared. I didn't have words for it. But I found out that the vice principal who I disclosed to already knew what was going on because this teacher had told her. And her response to me was, well, Joelle, don't say anything because this is what love is. And if you tell anyone, you're going to get in trouble. And in my head, I'm like, God, really? This isn't, I'm really up the creek now. So the abuse continued for 2 years. And by the time I graduated from high school, I was pregnant and had a sexually transmitted disease. The most horrific part, and I tell this to people all the time, and as people get older, they get it. The abuse itself was bad, but the treatment by the school and by my peers and by my parents was far more awful and traumatic and life-changing. I could have recovered from the abuse, but it took a long time to recover from 15 years of emotional turmoil brought on by other people. And I graduated from high school. I go to college. I struggle through. And then I move to Colorado. I get in a bad relationship. I get married. I don't have the emotional maturity to deal with it. So I, get divorced. And, I kind of was getting my life back on track. But there was still something. It's like every decision was a bad decision. And one day I woke up and I said, as you said in the intro, I have a real choice here. If I stay on this path I'm on, I'm going to die. And I'm going to die before I'm 30. Or I can really look at what I'm doing and make the serious decision right now to change my trajectory. And I chose to live. And so it was tough. And I had to really put on my big girl panties and stand up tall and do a lot of therapy and medication and all the stuff that I needed to do to recalibrate how I was thinking. And then something amazing happened. So by 2001, now I'm 31 and I'm living back in Orange County and I'm working for a PR firm and I'm doing reasonably well and I have a good career path. And a kid who was a few years behind me in high school, at a sister school, came forward and sued my high school principal and said that he had been sexually abused. Now, the diocese and the school could have said, oh, great, because all the parents wanted was therapy. But the Diocese of Orange and the school basically told him to go pound sand. And 5 years later, that case settled for $5 million. And I was floored. I was disgusted. I was floored. I'm like, why? These people haven't learned. They haven't learned anything. And we all knew what was going on. It was happening to me. The guy who sexually molested me went on to abuse a couple of my friends. The principal abused. I mean, we knew all these guys had no boundaries whatsoever and were just using their positions at high schools to get access to kids. And so I reached out to the diocese and I thought I could help there. And that went south pretty quickly because I'm a whistleblower and they don't really like that. That didn't go over very well. So in 2002, they changed the law in California, and they opened a 1-year window for adult survivors of child sexual abuse to come forward and use the civil courts to expose what happened to them. And I was so indoctrinated that I was not a survivor because, I remember when I disclosed to my parents and my mother told me, well, if you just kept your legs shut, you wouldn't be in this situation. My friends called me, my former friends called me a baby killer and said that I wanted it and I just wanted attention and so on and so forth. So I was pretty convinced I wasn't a survivor, but I went to talk to an attorney because I had a ton of information and I thought I could help the other survivors. And he sat me down and he goes, Joelle, what happened to you was a crime and it wasn't your fault. And you can help other people by coming forward and filing a lawsuit. It's nothing about the money. It's everything about exposing all the stuff that you know. So I thought about it. So I filed the lawsuit and I realized that my experience as a public relations professional dovetailed perfectly with what needed to happen in the child sexual abuse exposure movement with the Catholic Church. So suddenly, I became that person who was protesting out in front of churches and leafleting parishioners and letting them know about perpetrators and doing media interviews and educating parents and all this other stuff. And it was like, it was this 180 turn. I went from someone who like, oh, I'm not sure I'm a survivor to a chief spokesperson. And I found that there was such a need there and I was fortunate enough that I had particular gifts that could be helpful. Because I'd been a performer, I kind of just knew how to compartmentalize and get on stage and tell people what they needed to know. It was a long haul. And when the case settled in 2005, I got 200 pages of documents in my case. That's all I wanted were the documents. It's never about the money. It's about the vindication. And in the documents that were released in my case, they had a signed confession from the man who sexually molested me. They had signed confessions from administrators saying that they knew about it and covered it up. They had signed documents from the Diocese of Orange saying they knew about it and covered it up. It became my launching pad to embark on this whole new career, making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to another child. And the number one way to do that is to empower survivors to come forward. And so I went on a crusade and I traveled the world. I spoke to survivors on Guam and helped them pass legislation to come forward. I worked with survivors in Alaska, California, Oregon. I lobbied state legislatures in Colorado and Ohio and New York. We got a new law passed in California. But I realized there was something missing there because with the focus on the survivor side, I would get panicked parents calling me and saying, what can I do to, make sure, I'm scared about my school, or I'm scared to let my kid do this or that, or I'm scared my kid's going to be sexually abused. And I had this thick file of interviews with survivors, hundreds of them. And they all said the same thing. It was just like one or two things their parents could have done that could have stopped the abuse before it even started. And it's not that it was the parents' fault. It was just a simple decision or a simple question they could ask or a boundary they could put up. And because, especially in the 60s and 70s, I mean, I grew up in a school where if you said vagina, you got a detention. So it's not like parents were really empowered to say, I don't think it's cool that you're going camping with, Father Smith. They just said, oh, it must be an honor, and it must be okay that you're driving up to colleges with Mr. Hodgman and all this other. So that's when I decided to write my book, The Well-Armored Child. And that's when I was able to take all the research I had done and the interviews I had done and just it's like simple things that parents can do from birth to age 18 to stop sexual abuse in its tracks and to help other parents who might be struggling with the issue. And then I realized that, when you start talking about preventing abuse, especially with parents, so many people then come forward and say, it happened to me and I'm struggling. I need healing. I need help. And I'm not a therapist, but I am a big researcher and a writer, and I freelanced all over the place. And so I realized that there needed to be something that anyone who suffered from trauma can use as a launching point. And that's where my TED Talk came from, The Power of Responsibility. And from there, things exploded. It's been phenomenal because I've been able to, I felt so paralyzed and so useless and so broken for so long. And I realized that the best track to my healing has always been my ability to take someone's hand and say, let's do this together, because that's how it works. And I grow through my healing and my, understanding of the trauma that I went through when I work with someone else who's in the same place or not in the same, or whatever. But as long as we work together, and there's so many resources out there and so much great stuff that I believe that anyone has the capability to thrive, and because they don't have to do it on their own. So that's kind of where I got where I am right now. And I'm doing a lot of research right now on resiliency. A lot of it comes from the ACEs study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that was done by Kaiser Permanente. This was, 20 years ago, and they gave questionnaires to every single patient. So they had this huge control group, and they asked like 8 to 10 questions. And they found out that the more trauma people suffered, the more likely they were to have serious health conditions later in life. So if you're abuse, neglect, child sexual abuse, all this stuff, there's a statistical probability that you will more likely suffer from autoimmune cancer, diabetes, all these horrible things. And so I realized in my study of resiliency that if we can cut that path somehow and intervene earlier, that we can make sure that, the suffering that I've seen my colleagues go through who are 10, 15, 20 years older than I am, maybe we can stop that in its path and figure out a way to keep survivors and anyone who suffered from any kind of trauma, keep them healthy so that they not only can live a full life, but have the opportunity to thrive throughout the whole process. So that's a long way of saying, how did I get here?
Well, the one thing I will say, I don't think we had this conversation. I am a survivor of childhood sexual trauma myself through my father. Also in adult life, I also went through domestic abuse from a spouse. It's a little harder on my end, as you probably know, because I'm a man. I'm not small. I'm a bigger guy. And I'm going around now doing podcasts telling my story, because there's a lot of us that are men that are trapped in that cycle because of one thing you kind of touched on. Nobody believes us. I've had police laugh in my face. Look at you, look at her. But the thing is, being that I've been through abuse and saw my mother abused, right? I'm not the first man that's going to be keen to reel back and want to drill you, which a lot of women who wants to abuse men prey on that. If they have a man that's already been through abuse and they know they're against hitting a woman, they use that. That is part of their grooming process of doing that to a male. And I think one of the biggest things is believability. We all want to be believed. And when I was reading your story and what your mom said to you, I'm like, yeah, there's no believability here, which makes the whole thing worse. Now with the Me Too movement, we've got more people like you that's coming out blowing whistles. I think the believability is starting to increase, but it's still there. The one question I have for you is, no matter what church we turn on, it seems like the Catholic Church is always the one that has the biggest sexual situations going on. Why do you think that is? What is the reason for that?
I think that, well, first, let me say I'm really sorry. And what happened to you is not your fault. And by speaking out, it's so important, because I work with so many male survivors who are just like, I feel powerless. People don't believe me because I'm this big guy now, and they don't see I was a little kid, and they don't see I was a survivor of complex trauma. So I was able to be groomed by a woman who was able to then, make me the victim of domestic violence. And so I want to tell you how much I really appreciate you telling me that, and you're going to help a lot of people by speaking out. Back to my old friend, the Catholic Church. They are a victim of their own systems. So if you look at, how do we know everything that happened with Nazi Germany? How can we track every survivor in a camp and so on and so on? Because the Germans kept excellent records. Catholic Church did the same thing. For people who are not Catholic, there's like their human resources manual called the Code of Canon Law. And it starts way back, in whenever, probably like I don't know exactly when, probably like in the 500s, they started this Code of Canon Law. It's kind of like, how do you run a church? And so there's this one canon that requires that the bishop keep a locked file in his office. And in that locked file will be stuff that is really bad about their personnel, about priests and so on and so forth. And so there's a technical name for it. And of course, I didn't think I'd talk about it. So it's out of my mind. Menopause has killed every brain cell I have. So in these files in every bishop's office, they have everything. They know from the second a guy gets into seminary that he is inclined to abuse, because they call him things like emotionally immature or likes to spend time with kids or so on and so forth. And so they've created this culture over, 1,000+ years, because the church had to be institutional for the cover-up to really thrive. And the church became institutional, 400, 500 AD. And so they've created this culture and this system where they have everything recorded, and they have allowed behavior to continue and thrive that is not good behavior, period. They've created a culture where abuse is okay, and where they can justify it by saying, saying the kid is wrong. In the Catholic Church, we have a big problem with women, or having women come forward, because when people think, even the Catholic Church, to them, the sexual abuse of a boy by a man is aberrant. It's abhorrent. It's sinful, everything else. The sexual abuse of a girl just means that the girl was slutty. And so they don't care. And so it's kind of like the opposite of society. So that's why they have a culture of it. It is a male-centric culture of men who have never had productive relationships with women. They don't have kids. And it's not celibacy. It's just that it's the homogeneity of the whole system, and it's power and it's control. And we see that in a lot of other churches, but the Catholic Church has the best records. And that's why we were able to open it up. I mean, any institution that has a hierarchical structure, there's a big guy on top and a lot of people who want to answer to him and be the next big guy on top. That could be, the Southern Baptist Conference has had a big scandal. The Mormon Church has had a big scandal. The Boy Scouts, very ordered, structured organization where power goes up. They thrive on obedience and following rules. So it was very easy for bad volunteers to get in there, sexually abuse kids, and be protected by the Boy Scouts. They just, stuck it in a file somewhere and said, there must be a problem with the boy. And that's why we had 80,000 kids, now men, come forward and say they were sexually abused in the Boy Scouts. The Catholic Church gets all the bad press, mostly because they have the best documents. They've said the most dumb things in response to the crisis. They've treated the survivors horribly. And they uphold themselves to be a moral paragon of truth, way and light to God. And that's what gets people. When your local priest is the guy who can determine whether or not you're going to heaven and hell because he can deprive you of communion, that's a lot of power. And I think that really, I don't know what your language thing is, so I won't say what it did to survivors, but it made a lot of them mad. And so they came forward and wanted accountability. And then the parents felt ultimately betrayed too. Because, The church is where you baptize Mary and Barry, and then you find out that, they're molesting all your kids. I mean, these families were devastated. So that's, again, a very long answer to why we're really seeing that in the Catholic Church.
I do know, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, maybe it's changed, but I do know that most priests, bishops, I know nuns for sure, take a vow of celibacy. They pretty much wave off everything of the world. I was born Baptist and Methodist. At least back in the day, a Baptist minister and a Methodist minister had to have a wife. I mean, the joke was they would line up all of the women in the church that were single and say, here's one, choose one. Even though we know that didn't stop, right? And not really from them doing that. Do you think that it's heightened, though, because they've said we're not having sex ever, we're just devoting this to God? Do you think that makes it worse in the Catholic Church?
It does, because they have such unhealthy attitudes about healthy human sexuality. So they equate masturbation, the sin, I'm giving air quotes, of masturbation with the sin of molesting a child. Those are equal sins in the eyes of the Catholic Church. Now, when you do that, what are your other views going to be? And when you look at the older generation of priests, now, the number of priests are going way down, and guys entering the seminary tend to be older. They get their vocation after they've worked in the secular world for a while. But back in the old days, started as old as the early 80s, these guys would enter into the seminary at the age of 13, and they would be taught by men who were usually sexual abusers themselves. So they don't know any different. No one's taught them that it's wrong. The church itself is protecting them. So it is a seriously flawed system, because I believe that faith is built on the concept of family. And when you deprive someone of that ability, even if you don't, it's not whether or not you have a family, but that you have the support system so that you can develop healthy attitudes about sexuality and the self. And those priests they don't have it. And I think celibacy is the number one reason. And, the whole celibacy thing, it wasn't founded because, they thought, oh, God would appreciate that more. They kind of reverse engineered it. In the Middle Ages, priests could get married. Monks didn't. They took a vow of celibacy, but priests themselves did not. And the church found that if a priest died, he was willing the church properties to his kid. And you can't have that. So you just make everybody celibate. And then they reverse engineered it and said, well, we don't think Jesus had a family either, so that's why we do it. But yeah, I think it's extraordinarily unhealthy. I think that if you look at the settlements that we see in civil cases and the years of litigation, I mean, the church will pay hundreds of thousands of dollars an hour to attorneys to fight these cases. And it's because the bishops have no concept of money. They don't. They've never had to pay an electric bill. They've never had to, figure out, what a lease is like. To them, it's just ledger sheets. So the unhealthy attitudes go everywhere from sexuality to money to healing to what's best for these survivors, and because it's this horrible grip of power.
So more than ever now, it seems like that sexual abuse to a child is happening more and more. Every time I open a newspaper or hear something's going on, some teacher's doing something to a child or some adult that was trusted. Do you feel that there is more sexual abuse now than ever before? Do you feel that's true?
I don't. We have educated our society to report what we know. We have had sexual abuse has been around since humankind existed. And especially in the modern era, we were told to be quiet about it. We don't talk about it. It's ugly. It didn't happen. You're saying bad things about this person, so on and so forth. But what we have done in the past 15 years is change the communication around sexual abuse and around our sexuality. So we teach children the proper names of their body parts. We teach them, what are the proper boundaries to have. Other survivors have come forward. I remember talking to someone in like 2003 or 2004 and saying, yeah, we're going to get a flood of survivors. And it's not because abuse has increased, but it's because they're safer coming forward because they're going to be believed. And that I think that is the reason that we are seeing so many more cases. And it's really hitting the public schools hard because there's a whole phenomenon called passing the trash that they've been undergoing all these years. And so kids are coming forward and, they're finding out these files go back for, 10, 15, 20 years about this particular teacher. So I think that although it sounds scary, it's a good sign because it's empowering people to come forward. It's empowering children who are in the process of being abused to say, hey, wait a minute, this is wrong. And it's empowering survivors to get on the road to healing faster. And it's uncovering these ugly secrets.
Everybody said I was crazy, but I'm a 70s, 80s kid, and I was raised by a Southern Black woman who never, ever used pet names. So I was raised knowing what the real body parts of my body was, what a woman's body parts was. And people come over and be like, I can't believe you said it to him. It's like, somebody's got to teach him. I don't want him to learn that everywhere. And then when I met my wife, who I'm married to now, they had pet names. I'm like, what is that? Well, that's what my mom would call me. Like, I've never heard that because my mom was always telling me, this is what you got. This is what the woman has. It's important for you to know this so that nobody can trick you. She was concerned that somebody would trick me by using a name that it wasn't. And I would kind of fall into that. And then so I raised my kids the same way. I'm like, hey, they got to know what they have. So they know what they're up against if something happens.
That is the number one tool that I teach preschool parents to prevent child sexual abuse. Because it's the goal in prevention training is to make your kid a hard target because perpetrators are lazy. They don't want to spend their time convincing a kid to do something. They want the kid to be more compliant. And so if they start blurring boundaries with the kid and the kid says, that's my vagina and no one is supposed to touch it except for me and, when I'm at the doctor with my mom, then a predator will be like, I'm out of here. Because they want the kid who says, oh, that's my ha-ha. And then the predator can say, oh, I like to laugh. Let me see your ha-ha. And what it also does is it minimizes the importance of our sex organs, which are very important organs, not just for our sexuality, but for our general health. And we don't, call our kidney a pet name because we're embarrassed by the job that it does. We call it a kidney. We call our liver a liver because it has a very important job. Well, our sex organs have very important jobs too, and we need to make sure that they're healthy, especially as we get older and are susceptible to cancer and stuff like that. And so when you give, like your mom did, and like I did with my son, you give the biological names, stress the importance, and you empower your kid to use it. A predator's like, this kid's going to be way too much problem. I'm going to go over here to this kid who doesn't know the names of the parts.
I don't have the number one advocate for these things here very often. So I'm going to take my liberty to ask this question because I always wanted to know this. So do you think that groups like the Me Too movement help or hinder? Now, the reason I asked that question is the Me Too movement became really big around the Bill Cosby case. When I covered that case on my other podcast, my daughter and I did an update. And case number one, as you know, was pretty much a hung jury. They couldn't convict him. They threw that out. Me Too movement got started. Case number two, he was convicted and jailed. And on that podcast, I said, what changed between trial one and trial two? And the only thing that changed was the Me Too movement. Harvey Weinstein got brought down. Terry Crews comes out telling his stories and everything just happens. Do you think those groups help or hinder because it changes the way people may think about the case?
I think what it does is I think it helps. I think that there are a lot of problems that come with it. People who exploit the movement, like we saw that with, Time's Up. Time's Up. They try to form the big organization, then it falls apart, and that's a hindrance to the movement as a whole. I think that when it happens, like when Me Too happens, it is so overwhelming that a lot of people are like, I don't want to hear all this. Are they politicizing the issue? So on and so forth. But as it normalizes, what happens is people sit back like a jury. Let's say the jury's sitting on the Bill Cosby case. I'm sure that the lawyers interviewed them very carefully, but I'm sure every single one of them said, yeah, I remember so-and-so and, my friend at work and she was sexually harassed and some guy raped her, but she didn't say anything because she wanted to keep her job. So I think that, yes, I think it's extraordinarily helpful because it makes it safer for people to come forward. It normalizes talking about it, which I think is important, because if someone says me too, they're doing it on their terms. They don't have to be, standing on a street corner like I did for years, or doing podcasts and talking about it. All they need to do is say it happened to me too. And it heals a little wound inside your heart. I think it was a huge perceptual change in our society. I think there was a lot of pushback, but that pushback has continued to die down, because as more and more survivors come forward and more abuse is exposed in the court system and exposed in ways that it's like, hey, these women and men are telling the truth. I think that we're going to look back 20 years from now and be like, wow, Me Too really changed a lot. I think if you look at the, child sexual abuse in as a movement, I think 2002, when the Catholic Church had their big meeting and addressed it, and then, various lawsuits coming through, Me Too, Cosby, I think those are going to be great big game changers that we're going to look back, 20 years from now and say, wow, that's when everything changed. I mean, story about that. Sorry, I'm very talkative this morning. Apparently I had a lot of coffee. So I was sexually abused by a teacher at my high school. I get all the documents. My case settles in 2005. So I have these documents from everybody, including him, that says he did it. Well, when I was in college, he was allowed to quietly resign, because the school's like, we can't have you, these girls are beginning to grumble, and there's a number of them you've molested. So they let him quietly resign, and he becomes a music professor at a small college in Michigan. So when my case settles, I go there and I'm like, hey, you need to know this. I don't think you should be teaching, or at least it should be a mark on his record, so on and so forth. And the president of the college told me that I was just a disgruntled ex-girlfriend who was upset that my teacher boyfriend broke up with me. And that was an awful, awful day. So every 3 or 4 years, because I had these documents, they're all online. I mean, I scanned them and uploaded them back when we weren't doing that kind of stuff. And there would be, I'd write a letter or something, because there'd be a new crop of students, and I'd get horrible backlash. I mean, I get hundreds of emails. They'd flood my social media and be like, oh, Professor Hodgman's the greatest. You're just awful, and you're just trying to ruin his reputation. Then when Me Too happened, suddenly my story picked up a little bit of steam, and he was allowed to quietly retire. So Me Too made a lot of significant changes, because he admitted it. He said he did it. Everyone said he did it. And then we're finding now that, we're getting more and more grumblings from former students saying, oh, he blurred boundaries, he did this, he did that. And because it was they're all musicians and stuff, they're less likely to come forward, because it could hurt their musical career, because, he's still powerful in the industry. So I owe a lot to Me Too. I will say that.
So this is a dangerous question, but being you do institutions, I've always wanted to ask this question. So one of the biggest cases that happened between a student and a teacher in school was probably back in '96. Mary Kay Letourneau, Villain for Life. Yeah. Now, there's a lot of varying opinions on that because of how that went down. Now, of course, Billy has come out and said that he was the one that actually was the one that was pressing it and wanted to be with Mary Kay. As you know, Mary Kay goes to jail, gets out, she gets her hands slapped a couple times, but they just couldn't stay away from each other. When Billy turns 18, he has the restraining order permanently dropped, and they keep getting together. I mean, even risking jail, she continued to see him. They had a child.
They had two.
End up getting married, having more children, divorced before she passed at 58 long ago. How do you feel about those cases? Do you think that sometimes that there is a alternative to that? Do we think that a child at Billy's age at the time, I think 14, 15, is able to actually advance someone sexually like that? Or is it always the teacher or the adult's fault with that?
He was 11. This case makes me so mad. He was 11 when she started molesting him. And he was never in a healing place to realize. And now in interviews he's doing now, he says, yeah, I'm a survivor, but he was so groomed by her. And we see this in other cases too, just not at this extreme. In the Catholic Church, we see victims who will have their priest perpetrator officiate their wedding. they can't understand. They just have this like, because the perpetrator just has really just messed with their mind so much. And I think Vili Falau was never allowed to heal, was never given any kind of therapy, was never given an example of a healthy relationship. His family, I believe his parents were immigrants. So there wasn't a lot of, I think that they were dealing with a lot of cultural issues and like, we don't want to cause a lot of problems, but they did press the criminal thing. I think that she was a very, very skilled predator. I think that she had groomed him so successfully and kept him so insulated that he was never able to, come to healing until after she died. In recent interviews with Vili, he looks at his daughters and he's like, oh my God. A lot of times for survivors, having kids makes it real. Because when you're 11, you think you can conquer the world. And then you become an adult and you see another 11-year-old and you think, oh my God, this kid's an idiot. He needs support, not sexual molestation. And so I think that he is on a healing process now. I think it is never okay for an adult to sexually abuse a child and to cultivate that relationship. I think she should have spent a lot more time in jail. And I hope that poor Vili Falau gets all of the help he needs, because he's going to be grappling with this for a long time.
I don't know where he is with his mom, but if you go back through the transcripts, it turns out that his mom started to get greedy. She wanted to keep pressing these cases because there was monetary gain out of it, which I'm looking at going, well, you're really not caring about your son. You're putting him through all this stuff because you want money, and you're not looking at what it's going to do to him in the long run. But from a lot of people I talk to, they're like, well, if they're going to be together, let them be together. He's grown now and, they're together. And I'm like, yeah, but this started when he was a kid. Maybe he feels obligated to be that way.
He didn't know any different. And so I didn't know that. Maybe I did know that about his mom, but it escaped along with all the other facts I needed to know when I went through menopause. We see that a lot with parents because kids who are sexually abused seldom come from healthy, happy, strong homes. There's always something else going on there. With my family, it was the alcoholism and my mother's emotional abuse. Because a predator needs to find a way in. So there was already a weakness there that she found because, she had a classroom full of 11-year-olds every single year and a husband and kids at home. So when parents do things like that, that most likely caused him further damage, because now you're nothing but a pawn. You're nothing but a payday. And that's terrible. Yes, that's a lot for a kid to live with. And again, all the money in the world doesn't heal the wounds of child sexual abuse. It just allows you to pay for more therapy. But it's never about the money. Unfortunately, it's the only way our civil justice system knows how to punish people who do bad things.
Now, how do we protect our kids in school now? Because, I have a 13-year-old who's my last one that's going to be entering high school next year. My wife and I've had this conversation. And I said, to me, it feels like some of these kids are set up because teachers are getting younger. When I was in school, I had Miss Jones, who was in a muumuu and was 20 years older than me, and I had no thoughts of doing that. But now we have younger teachers that's coming in that are looking at some of these girls and guys going, oh my gosh, I'm only 3 years older than her or him, and it wouldn't be bad to hook up with that. How do we combat that if the institutions that we're sending our kids to is not doing the proper vetting that they should do to make sure these things don't happen?
It's about communication, and it's about talking to your kids frankly and openly about, it is never okay for a teacher to be alone with you in a room with the door shut, to, frontal hugs, kisses. None of that is okay. It's just the adult taking advantage of you. And you empower them to report, because when you look at, like in my own case, the first person I reported to after I was shot down by the vice principal was one of my peers. She wasn't equipped to handle it. She didn't know what to do. And it was the 80s. There was nothing that anyone could do that anyway. But when my kid hit an age where I knew that someone could disclose to him or he could see something, I empowered him to report. So this is what you do. Choose 5 safe people in your life, mom, dad, so on and so forth, and you can work through them together. What happens if you see something? Well, if you see something going on, like if you see child sexual abuse going on, say, I'm going to call 911. Call 911. You report to mom. This is reporting area, the number in your area that you can call and say, I saw something I didn't like. If a friend reports to you, you tell that friend, hey, I am your friend, but I cannot keep this secret because this is not a good secret. And so I can talk to my mom about it, and we're gonna get help so that you're safe. And you empower your kids to do that, because once that conversation is normalized, then when a teacher does break that boundary, the kids are like, ooh, that's weird and wrong. You're not supposed to do that. And so, there's a way to, when you talk to your kids, but you don't have to give them age inappropriate discussions of sex. They don't have to know. All they have to know is what they are equipped to handle, and that it's wrong and it's okay to talk about it. And then once you start that communication, kids will tell you everything. And they won't tell you about, they'll tell you about what's going on with the other kids in class. And hopefully your own child will disclose as well. So I think that the more we talk about it, the more that we normalize the conversation, the more that we focus on healthy boundaries and telling our kids, that's just not cool. Do you see dad be alone in a room with a closed door with a teenager? No, because it's wrong, and the teacher shouldn't do that either. So there's a lot you can do, and it really empowers our kids to be safer from predators everywhere, not just at school.
Do you feel that we were scaring our kids by showing them things? What I mean by that is this. I've sat down with my teenage kids. Even now, my daughter's 20. She's going off to CBU, California Baptist University. I've told them, because you're going to a Christian college don't mean anything. We went to her opening day at Lancers, and the guy was like, hey, I'm letting you guys know 70% of all students that come here don't know Christ, don't want to know him, ain't Christians. They do their own thing. And we uncovered that there was a murder years ago that took place at CBU. But I sit down with her and my 13-year-old, we watch Web of Lies. I'm like, hey, this is what a predator does. I've watched several different shows about teachers that's doing these things. And somebody's like, you're just setting your kid up because you're scaring them. I'm like, I'm preparing them for what's out there. Do you think that I'm doing harm, or anybody who does this is doing harm to their kid? Or are we preparing them?
As long as you empower your kid from a place of strength and not fear. When you teach your kid about what to look for, how to stop sexual abuse, how to avoid sexual assault. There are some great programs out there for college students to avoid situations that can get that, and how to protect themselves and their friends. They're actually stronger and fitter and better. If you just go to your kid and say, don't get raped, that scares them. You're giving your daughter tools. If you give someone tools, you empower them to create and fix and everything else. If you just use fear, like after 9/11, kids everywhere were scared to death because they saw the news and so on and so forth, because they weren't empowered to do anything about it. It's like, is the plane going to hit my building next? But if we teach kids to empower themselves so they can stop it, and they can stop it if they see it happening to their friends, we're not scaring them. We're in fact making them strong individuals who will make their school safer, because they're the kind of person who says, yo, friend who's had too much to drink, why don't you stay with me and not go upstairs with that guy? Here, let's go home, And so you empower your kids to make great informed decisions, give them tools. And, there are some excellent programs for college kids. How to identify problems, how to use the buddy system, what to say to someone who is drunk, about to go upstairs with some guy she doesn't know, what to say to her so that she doesn't get belligerent, and so on and so forth. So there's so many wonderful tools that allow your kid to go to college without fear and be empowered. Because, there's sexual assault can be prevented most of the time. And if we give our kids tools to do that, then no, that's great. It's great.
So I know you said earlier that you're getting into this. So what is resilience, and how have you helped survivors build that up?
I am a firm believer in the law of attraction, and that people with their attitudes and their thoughts and feelings will bring on other thoughts and feelings and actions of the same flavor. So I work a lot with survivors who are the kind of person that has a dark cloud over their head. Everything bad happens to me. I'm never going to make it. I'm a bad person. And then decisions and the people that they attract in their life and circumstances tend to follow that. Well, resilience is a skill. Resilience isn't just a trait, it's a skill. And it can be built with things like understanding proper boundaries in relationships. And I'm not even talking about romantic, I'm talking about every relationship in your life. I mean, there was a time where I had to tell my mother before she died, it's like, you're out of here. You are too toxic and you're really causing a lot of problems. And once I did that, it's like I was able to create this healthy space. There are things like anchoring your day the second you get up. It's so easy for a trauma survivor to wake up and say, oh no, another crappy day and got to deal with all this stuff and I'm grumpy and I didn't sleep well. And that tears away at your resilience. But if you make the conscious effort to be like, you wake up and you're grateful for what you do have instead of regretful for what you don't. And there's certain things you do all the way down. And it was the stuff that, when I was really in the depths of my depression, I thought were cheesy. And now I'm like, oh, I get it now. I understand. And it doesn't have to be, it can be so overwhelming to be a trauma survivor because everyone says you should do this and you should do that and you have to do this and you have to take your medication, you have to go to therapy and you have to do group. And so you can teach resiliency in just bite-sized nuggets and give people the skills they need to make sure that their entire attitude and they can, slowly rewire their brain. And it's all based in science and biochemistry. So I go through all this process because I believe that everyone has the right not just to thrive, but to out-thrive the person they were yesterday. And it can all be done with the power of our mind, with gratitude, with forming strong boundaries, with surrounding yourself in positivity and things like that, and all anchored in science and realism.
Now, to all of this, you became an author. The book, The Well-Armored Child, The Power of Responsibility. Tell us a little bit about that book. Why should we go out and grab that? What are we going to teach us in that book?
Well, those are actually two books. So The Well-Armored Child is The Parent's Guide to Preventing Child Sexual Abuse. And I learned a very valuable lesson with that book, which is that, parents don't read big, thick books. But what I did was it's a very easy to use guide to prevent child sexual abuse and to armor your kid against predators, no matter what age your child is. And I have age sections. So each chapter is a different age group. And what I was able to do after that book was published was tear out some of the chapters and make those individual books. So if you go on my website, Casteix.com, you can see the smaller books as well. But what I found was I wanted to create a book that a parent, no matter how old their kid was, could pick up and like, oh, I need to go to page 312. Oh, this is how I have this conversation with my kid. Oh, this is the science behind it, so on and so forth. So it's a book to help parents keep their kids safer from abuse. I'm really proud of that book. It's helped a lot of people. The Power of Responsibility is based on my TED Talk, and it's just 6 steps to, rewire your brain and find happiness. Because I believe that it is, along with resiliency, it's our responsibility. And sometimes that's the toughest decision you have to make. It's that decision to become resilient. It's that decision to take responsibility for your healing because no one can do it for you. I also have some smaller ebooks, which are free because they're important and I need to get them in people's hands. One is The Compassionate Response, and it's a guide for people who have a friend or loved one come forward to them and say, I was sexually abused as a child. Because no one teaches you what to say. You just kind of stand there, oh, I'm sorry. So you need to do more. And so it has resources. It shows the importance of your role and how to build boundaries for yourself and for the survivor. Because a lot of times when a survivor comes forward, they really rely on you and it's building those proper boundaries and helping the survivor get on the road to resilience without being there, without carrying them, but instead just being a guide and opening the door with a key that you have of information and help. So, and then I'm working on a new book on resilience, and that's just in the planning phases, but I hope to have that out in the next year or so.
Now, I seem to always jar my guests because I tell everybody, I do research, So doing further research into you, I discovered that you are a part of a very unique app called Spot the Line.
Yes.
Never heard of it, never seen it, but it helps identify when you're getting into a harassment, sexual harassment situation or predators. Can you tell us a little bit about Spot the Line?
So I am, among my other things, and kind of an expert in how tech can prevent and identify and expose child sexual abuse. And I've worked on AI projects that have tried to, find those patterns of abuse. I work with a nonprofit now that does triage for police departments when they get reports of someone downloading child pornography. It identifies who these people are and what their interactions are with children so that, the cops can go after the high school principal and then put the guy who lives on an island by himself and hasn't seen a child in person in 20 years. They can put them lower on the list, but they'll go after that principal first. So Spot the Line, they reached out to me during COVID, and they are working on an app that can go through a series of questions. We worked with HR professionals and legal professionals, just a list of questions to figure out if someone or someone they know is being sexually harassed. And the questions go by degree. So if you take, you go down one path, it will continue to take you down a particular path based on the severity of the questions. Spot the Line is suffering from a cash crunch. So the app is in the beta phase. It hasn't been really released and put out there because we were also working on an app to identify possible child sexual abuse. So those are kind of on hold. But I believe that whether it's Spot the Line or somebody else, tech offers us some of the greatest solutions to some of the big social problems we have. Because when you're on your phone, no one's looking over your shoulder and you can answer honestly. It's also the same reason we have a problem with predators grooming kids over the internet, because kids are on their phone in their room and they feel safe and sound and no one's going to hurt them, when in fact some 40-year-old dude in his basement down the street is grooming this kid into child sexual abuse. So I believe that we can truly use tech to empower people without scaring them, like we talked about before, and empower them to understand what they are currently going through, what they are seeing, and how to report.
And I do think that the more responsible tech companies is building these in. Apple recently built in something called Safety Check, which allows you to go in to see who has access to information and completely block them. So if you do have an abusive relationship you're leaving and that person has that, you can get rid of them and then they can't track you anymore. So when I read about Spot the Line, I'm like, this is interesting. I've never seen an app like that. Like you said, it's discreet, can be used without people knowing, and person can get some help with that. So I hope that comes out to be very big, and wish you guys success with that.
Well, thank you. And what we're learning, it's the same reason, I give away a book like The Compassionate Response. I'm not going to charge someone money to learn what to do when someone comes forward to them. You just need like a large brochure. It's like 15 pages. It's the same thing with what Spot the Line has to offer. It's something that in our heart of hearts, we just couldn't charge people for, unless we went through the industrial route and went through like large companies who wanted to identify sexual harassment within there. But you can't charge an individual who's in crisis to find out how to report. And that was so we're working through that. And I think that no matter what, there are wonderful resources out there that will allow people to truly empower themselves to report harassment, report abuse, and stop the cycle. And, it's a deterrent, because if everyone has an app on their phone, the sexual harassment meter, everyone has an app on their phone, how to identify child sexual abuse, predator's going to be like, I'm not really going to be in this particular community because everyone seems to be empowered. And they'll go elsewhere. Now, you don't want them to go elsewhere, but you want them to find no safe haven. And that's my goal.
So what can the listeners do to help?
Talk to your kids. Number one, talk to your kids. Empower them with good information about their bodies and boundaries. You can read them in my book, or you can read them on a million websites on the internet on how to talk to your kids safely and without uncomfortable discussions of sex, how to protect themselves from child sexual abuse. Talk to your community if something happens, and talk to people you know about the problem of child sexual abuse, because you may, talk to a neighbor and be like, wow, I'm talking to my kids about abuse, and that neighbor may be a survivor, and you're helping them in two ways. Number one, you're helping them find the language to talk about what happened to them. And number two, you're making it safe for them to come forward. Number three, definitely support legislation in your state that allows survivors to come forward. Because, for example, I was abused between 85 and 87, between 15 and 17. I had until I was 19 years old to come forward and file criminal charges, even after everything he did. And I only had until I was like 24 or 25 to come forward civilly. So he was like scot-free. And a lot of states are still like that. But then when we reopened the statute of limitations, it allowed me and hundreds of others to come forward. So anytime a state wants to extend the criminal statute of limitations, because they can't do it retroactively, or retroactively extend the civil statute of limitations, support that, because the more we allow survivors to come forward, the more we can stop the cycle of abuse. Because 9 times out of 10, those old survivors coming forward, the predator's still out there abusing kids.
In closing, what do you want people to take away from your story in our conversation here today?
Human beings are extraordinarily powerful when it comes to their own health and healing. And through communication and through personal empowerment, just in steps, we can heal from our past trauma, or begin the process of healing. And we can keep other people safe. Child sexual abuse is a horrible crime, and I don't believe that we will ever actually be able to completely abolish it. But the more we talk about it, the more we create resilience in survivors and support them. And the more we empower our kids to be a hard target to eventually stop that cycle of abuse.
Well, Joelle, I thoroughly thank you for coming on the show today. I have learned a lot more than I ever learned before. And I hope that the audience has gotten some good insight of how they can help. And I want to thank you personally for being the advocate for the voiceless and doing what you're doing. I think you're doing an excellent job, and I'm a better person for knowing you today.
Well, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation.
Well, you're welcome to come back anytime. I will be reading your books. So I'll let you know when I'm done, and maybe you can come back and we can have a full-fledged discussion around those.
I would love it. It'd be great.
All right, Joelle, thank you very much. All right, guys, that's the amazing Joelle Castex. You can pick up her book, The Well-Armored Child or Parent's Guide to Preventing Sexual Abuse, as well as all of her other ones at Amazon. Also at Casteix.com. You can go and check out what she's doing. I will link her TED Talk in the description. You need to check that out. Make sure you are supporting her. She is doing God's work out here when it comes to our children and to those of us who are adults that are survivors now that are trying to find our way. So I thank you for tuning in today. I hope you've learned something. I hope you guys are being safe out there. Always be good to yourself, to each other, and always remember, always stay humble. An act of kindness can make someone's day. A little love and compassion can go a long way. And remember that there is an extraordinary person in all of us. I'll catch you guys in the next one.
Don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe. Join us on social media. One link to the link tree has it all. Feel free to drop us a line at truecrimeandauthors@gmail.com. Cover art and logo designed by Arslan. Sound mixing and editing by David McClam. Intro script by Sophie Wild and David McClam. Theme music, Legendary by New Alchemist. Introduction and ending credits by Jackie Voice. See you next time on True Crime, Authors, and Extraordinary People.